Okay, thank you. What I'm going to talk about today is actually some work that's been done as part of several different GRDC funded projects. So it might feel a little bit, you know, we're moving from topic to topic, but really I think that what I want to talk about are just some sort of key emerging issues that we're starting to see that I think that advisors need to know about. But given it's across a whole, well, 3 different projects, there's a whole range of people who've actually contributed to this work, so lots of names on the slides. So the first thing I want to talk about is our regular herbicide resistance surveys. As most of you know, we do this every year at a different part of South Australia or Victoria, and we're now in the position, at least for Victoria, of having come back 5 years after our first surveys. So the last 2 years, so 2010 harvest, we're in Western Victoria, 2011 harvest, we collected from Northern Victoria. What are probably the most useful information now that comes out of these surveys is what's changing, what's moving, what's shifting, what do you have to start worrying about? A couple of things, one of which has been that we've seen, at least in Western Victoria, a fairly big increase in the amount of trifluoride resistance that we're picking up in our random surveys in ryegrass. Now, we all know why that is, because, you know, growers use a lot of trifluoride. We didn't see so much, well, we didn't see any in Northern Victoria, but certainly in Western Victoria that's an issue. A second one, perhaps more so in South Australia, but also starting to trend up in Victoria, has been select resistance. So we're starting to see more and more ryegrass with resistance to select, predominantly in areas where there are lots of break crops, but it's definitely out there. We also, for the last few years, we've included Intervix as one of the herbicides that we've been testing for, largely on the back of the increasing use of clearfield technology by growers. And what we find with Intervix is that there's quite a lot of resistance out there. You know, where we've sampled so far, between 18 and 50% of the populations are resistant to Intervix. And a lot of this occurs even though the clearfield varieties might not be widely grown in that area. What's causing this is that right across the area we have high levels of resistance to the group B sulfonylureas, and some of that translates over as cross resistance to Intervix. So for ryegrass, you know, the pump's already been primed for Intervix resistance by use of sulfonylurea chemistry, and so when growers go into clearfield, they just pull that Intervix resistance right out quite quickly. So, you know, I think that the future of clearfield technology for ryegrass control is extremely limited. You know, we're likely to get a couple more years out of it, and then that'll be done and dusted. Clearfield technology will be for those other weeds out there. And in fact, in some areas, that's primarily what it's used for, you know, things like brome control. So they're the sort of big moving things, if you like, the big things that have changed over the last 5 years. One of the things that we did do as part of the sort of 10 years of data collection that we did have prior to the last year was to ask the question, who had what? And we tested 6 herbicides. So what we've got here is we've got the frequency as a percent of population, so this is over 1,000 populations tested, versus the number of resistances in each sample. So we tested 6 herbicides so you could get up to 6. And what we found was that just under half the samples we tested had 0 or 1 herbicide resistances in them. And around about 40% had 4 to 6. So it was very much a bimodal distribution. So guys either had not a lot of resistance in ryegrass, or they had a lot of resistance in ryegrass. There weren't too many in that sort of middle group. Why? Well, when we started looking geographically as how these were being distributed out, what we tended to find was that these ones had a tendency to be in areas where there was still a lot of stock and pasture in the rotations. So the Mallee, Northern Eyre Peninsula, for example, and some other places where rotations were primarily crop and pasture rotations. These guys turned up in places like the mid-north of South Australia, parts of the southeast of South Australia, the Wimmera, southern Victoria, where continuous cropping has become the norm, and the paddocks are cropped every year. So, you know, it's probably not telling you anything you don't know, but really the guys who aren't continuous cropping have much lower herbicide resistance risks and are going to find that much easier to manage than the guys who are continuously cropping. So in terms of managing resistance, I think we really need to make sure we've got a good focus on our continuous croppers and really impart to them that they have very high risks of herbicide resistance and they need to manage that appropriately. One of the things that we've been doing over the last few surveys in response to requests from consultants and from GRDC is to widen the number of weeds we've been looking at. So we first went into the other grass weeds, but we're now looking at some broadleaf weeds as well. This is just the Victorian data I'm showing here for the last two surveys. Wild oats at the top. Basically, there's not a lot of resistance out there in wild oats, about 10% to wildcat, none to Atlantis and a little bit to Manavit. And we're actually more or less consistently seeing this in South Australia and Victoria. Whilst we're getting very, very high levels of resistance to ryegrass, we tend not to find the same with wild oats. And some of that's just about the biology of wild oats. You know, we do find areas where wild oats resistance is very, very bad, but the next door farm's got none. So it's not really the problem ryegrass is. Bottom's brome grass. The Victorian survey, so in Western Victoria we've got up to about 10%, well 7% resistance to the Group A chemistry. Most of that's located up around Swan Hill, so it is very, very localised. And in Northern Victoria we've got 7% resistance to Atlantis. And in fact when we looked at some of our other survey samples with Atlantis in brome, we're starting to see a fair bit of resistance to those sulfonide ureas in brome grass. So that's starting to trend up. We're starting to see a trend up in Group B resistance, and ultimately, just probably like it happened with ryegrass, we'll see that some of that will transfer over to IMI resistance in brome. The resistance testing that's being done is already finding a little bit of IMI resistance in brome, so it's already out there. But our use of sulfonide ureas is going to help get that as well. So I think that brome grass is very much a weed we need to keep our eye on in terms of resistance management. Moving on to some broadleaf weeds, we've been, where we go out and we find broadleaf weeds in reasonable numbers in a paddock, we'll collect them. One of the things about this though is we're actually not finding a huge number of paddocks containing a lot of broadleaf weeds in them. Primarily what we're discovering is grasses. South Thistle is probably one of the ones where we find quite a bit of it in paddocks, particularly in pulse paddocks. When we test our South Thistle samples for resistance to glean, they're pretty much all resistant, 80 to 90%. And the seed blows around, so it's something that everybody's going to get fairly shortly. So Group B, or at least the sulfonide ureas on milk thistle, just aren't working anymore. So we're going to have other things that work on those. The brassicas, so in 2010 we found quite a bit of Indian hedge mustard in Western Victoria. We didn't pick up any wild radish samples, and in Northern Victoria we found no Indian hedge mustard samples, but we picked up a couple of wild radish samples. So we tested those. The Indian hedge mustard ones, 40% resistant to glean, 28 to eclipse, no resistance to 2,4-D. Okay. And we would suggest from work we've done in South Australia that we would expect to find relatively high levels of Group B resistance in Indian hedge mustard, largely based on its biology. For wild radish, we found no resistance to the Group Bs, but 50% of them were resistant to 2,4-D. But don't get too shocked about that, Trevor. We only had 2 samples, so 1 out of 2. But I think the important point about that is that we knew there was a bit of 2,4-D resistance in Victoria because of material that's being tested, but it's actually at a level now where we can pick it up in our surveys. So it's something I think to really keep a a watch on. You know, if growers are starting to struggle to get 2,4-D to control their wild radish, it's time to make a change. Okay, you all went to the wild radish talk yesterday. I don't have to tell you any more about that. So I'm going to change now. I'm going to talk about clethodim for a while. One of the things that's concerned us for some time has been the increase in clethodim resistance that we've been seeing, because that was sort of our last post-emergent in-crop ryegrass herbicide we had. And in the last year, we had a new student come on board, so we decided to take advantage of it and actually put some trials out to ask the question, if you've got clethodim-resistant ryegrass, what are your tools for managing that? What can you do? So we had 2 trials, one in canola, one in faba beans, and to really make sure that the population we were dealing with was resistant, we went to a paddock, happened to be on the Roseworthy farm, that we were fairly confident had select resistance in it because we'd had a trial in that paddock a couple of years before and select hadn't worked too well. And we collected some seed then, so we tested the seed, and this is the dose response. So here's how many survived, this is your clethodim rate. Here's your 250 mil rate, that's your 500 mil rate, this is your 1 litre rate. You know, this stuff was resistant to 500 mils and a bit to a litre. Okay, so, you know, good resistance to clethodim. When we tested it to butroxydim or factor, it also turned out to be resistant to that. Now, we see a variety of patterns with clethodim resistance. We see populations that just have low-level resistance to clethodim. We see ones that have high-level resistance to clethodim. And of those high-level ones, we see some that have resistance to butroxydim and some that don't. This is one that has resistance to both. So high-level resistance to clethodim and resistance to butroxydim. So this is just about your worst-case scenario. So we put the trial out. You'll notice up there that there's no nil, because our attitude was that no farmer would actually manage canola without putting any herbicides in it if they had ryegrass in the paddock. So we compared everything to what we considered to be the sort of district practice. So this is TT canola. So we've got atrazine IBS followed by 500 mils of select as a post-emergent. Okay. And what we've got here is this is the number of plants we had 8 weeks after sowing. That was the day before we put the select out. So that's what our pre-emergent herbicides are doing in this trial. Okay. This is the number of spikes at harvest. So this is the total population. So the higher the number there, the worse things have gone. And there's our crop yield. Now, it wasn't a fabulous year for spring for canola in South Australia, so yields are down a bit, but you know, 1.3 tonnes wasn't too bad considering. Okay, this here's your low rate of select, your 250 mil rate. Some guys still use that, not much around us, but some guys still use that. And when we look at the number of spikes, so we go from 149, almost double it. Okay, so you know, when you're starting to get select resistance out there, going out with the low rates of limited value. You want to go out with the highest rate you can put on that crop at that time. This is canola. You've always got to be careful with select on canola. So the 500 mil rate was the thing to do. When we added factor to that, we got an improvement. Wasn't significant, and you know, yields were about the same. Okay, so that was about the best we could do. We tried a bunch of pre-emergent mixes, some stuff that we'd been playing with that might get registered for canola, some stuff that was Chris Preston saying, oh gee, we haven't tried that before, maybe we should just stick it out. And I think that, you know, generally speaking, none of that actually worked terribly well except this last one here. So I think, you know, to some extent, the pre-emergent herbicide pool for canola is fairly empty in terms of being able to manage ryegrass. The other problem with these break crops, of course, is that if you don't get the ryegrass early, because they don't have the same level of competition that wheat applies or barley applies to ryegrass, then the populations really do blow out. And you can see that you know, some of these you know, yields were very, very ordinary. So I think the message that really we've got with canola is that select resistance in canola, we don't actually have a whole lot of places to go. Now, we probably need something else in our system. So and that might be, we need to perhaps rethink how we use canola in the rotation, making sure we don't put it into really dirty paddocks where we can't get control of the ryegrass. Pretty much a similar story with faba beans. It was actually a very ordinary year for faba beans in South Australia last year with that really sharp finish. So yields were way down. This was our farmer practice. We added factor to that. There's still a lot of ryegrass in there because the population was resistant to both of them. So really all we did was suppressed it a bit, but we still had a lot of ryegrass. And the ryegrass that did survive produced a lot of seed heads because of the lack of competition. So that was about the best we could do. We tried a whole stack of interesting pre-emergent herbicides, some of which are registered for other things and some of which aren't, mixed with other stuff that we could put out, and by and large, really, except for this particular treatment, nothing much worked. But the bottom line with that particular treatment is you're not going to use it in faba beans because it's going to kill your faba beans. So, in faba beans, and probably true of the other pulses, we're probably, with select resistance, sitting in the same position. Okay? We can no longer, I think, really rely on them to help us clean up a bad ryegrass population if there's good select resistance there. We're going to have to do something else with them in the rotation. We're going to continue to look for, is there anything out there that'll help us? So I've more or less had these conclusions, but clethodim is only partially effective on resistant population, but it does depend how resistant, so it's useful knowing how resistant the population is. Will 500 mils work or not? Pre-emergent herbicides alone are not effective in the break crops, so just going out with a pre-emergent and shutting the gate, that's not going to do the job at all. And the best thing is pre-emergent followed by clethodim and butroxydim. If you can get butroxydim this year, that's going to be a question mark. Okay, one other thing that came up quite a bit last year, not last year, the year before, 2011, was this issue about clethodim not working when people thought it should be working, and was it resistance or was it something else? And so 2011 we had a lot of quite cold conditions through July when people would have been putting clethodim out, and we know because we've done work on this that clethodim doesn't work so well under cold conditions. But the issue was there was actually not a lot of data out there. So we thought about putting some trials out and gathering some data, and we actually did have a trial out, but at the end of the day we didn't actually get the conditions we want. But we got access to a frost chamber. So we did a trial in the frost chamber where we could actually control the conditions. Now, we didn't actually really frost these ryegrass, we just chilled them. So they got 12 hours of 4 degree at night and 12 hours of 10 degrees in the daytime for 3 days running. And then we sprayed them with clethodim and they went back into warmer conditions. Or we had them in warm conditions, we sprayed them and we chilled them for 3 days, or we didn't chill them at all. And then we did a dose response on resistant and susceptible because we wanted to know what the two types were doing, and looked at their response. What we're looking for, do we see a shift in the response? So this is just a normal dose response, so this is just dry weight on this side. These are clethodim rates. This is a susceptible population. Its rates are really low. Susceptible populations you can really kill with clethodim. These are all 3 leaf stage ryegrass, so they're all little. So we got no frost, we got the frost beforehand, and we got the frost afterwards. Well, this is no frost and the frost beforehand. Okay, the curves are virtually identical. Okay, but 3 days of frost afterwards, we've shifted that curve out, and you actually need about twice as much clethodim to control that ryegrass. Same thing with the resistant population. So here's no frost, there's your frost beforehand, this one up here, that's your frost afterwards. Same story. So one of the things that's probably happening out there that's really complicating our management of this material is that if we get really cold conditions, which we do in July a lot, after putting the herbicide out, and you've got a little bit of resistance in that population, then it's unlikely to be very effective because you need about twice as much. So those situations where growers said, oh no, it worked last year but it didn't work this year, could simply be a different environment that's going on. So I think that's one of the things just to think about. I mean, it's not something we can actually, in a management practice, do a lot about, except by moving our clethodim applications earlier. We know that clethodim is much more effective on weeds at this stage than on big tilled things, and it's also going to be warmer earlier. So that might be a good management strategy to say, well, let's not go out and treat big tilled ryegrass with clethodim. Let's get that clethodim on early at that 3 to 4 leaf stage and get our ryegrass then. And then we've got to worry less about what resistance is doing and less about what the environment's doing. Okay, so that's enough of clethodim. I want to just touch on a couple of other topics, one of which is Indian hedge mustard. This is some triazine resistant Indian hedge mustard. We got this seed sent to us last year. It comes from Victoria. And this is the dose response. So we've got survival here. This is our susceptible population. You actually kill Indian hedge mustard quite nicely with atrazine. This is all post-emergent. You do it quite nicely. Here we've gone out to 4 kilos of active and really haven't killed very much. Okay, so this is the photograph. They've all been treated with 4 kilos of atrazine, active. So big rate, it's resistant to group Cs. The interesting thing about this stuff, and we're looking at them right now, is what's its cross-resistance pattern across the group C chemistry. Do we have other products we can use? So that's there. This one came in the year before. Late in the season, there's some seed. This is Diflufenican resistant Indian hedge mustard, also from Victoria. So here's our dose response. That's our susceptible. This is Diflufenican rates, your field rates here. Not doing much to the resistant population. We've gone out to 4 times the field rate. It stunts them up a bit, but it's not killing them. So again, we've got resistance there. So now we have in Indian hedge mustard B, C, I and F resistance. So you all went to the talk on wild radish yesterday in Western Australia? Yeah, well we've got B, C, I and F now in Indian hedge mustard in Eastern Australia. Fortunately, we don't yet have them all together. Both of these populations turned out to be susceptible to group B chemistry. But it's only a matter of time. And when we get B, C, I and F all together, we don't have too many other bits of chemistry to use. We've got one mode of action, really. So this is something I think we really need to keep an eye on is you know, how we're managing Indian hedge mustard. Just want to touch on glyphosate resistance. This is all in the paper, so you don't actually have to read the slide, and you probably know most of it anyway. But annual ryegrass is getting glyphosate resistance wherever glyphosate is used. It doesn't matter where it's being used, doesn't matter in what situations, it's getting glyphosate resistance. And I'm just about getting tired of counting the number of samples that we've got. I'll keep doing it for a while, but I reckon we'll be over 500 by the end of this year. You know, it's just getting out a bit everywhere. So, but I think the important point is it's not just in the paddock, it's all those other uses that are important. And I think growers have got to really, you know, get their head around that it's more than what they're doing. And have got to make sure that they don't bring it in from off their farm. So that's ryegrass, and in fact I actually want to talk about some of these other weeds, some of which will be no interest to you, but I think there's some important things here. Barnyard grass, won't worry about that, you don't have to worry about barnyard grass, but fleabane. We're picking up quite a bit of resistance to fleabane, and this isn't, you know, spraying plants this high with glyphosate. We're spraying little rosettes with 3 litres of glyphosate, and I can tell you, you spray those rosettes with 3 litres of glyphosate and you kill them. Okay? But these guys are resistant, and the places, you know, irrigation channels around buildings, roadsides, railways, okay, a lot of it's being done off farm. This stuff blows, it's going to blow onto farm. So I'm thinking we almost have to get to the situation where we say, well, glyphosate's not going to work on fleabane. You know, it might be a couple of years, but that's where we're going to be. When we've done our work on this, we actually haven't found any in Victoria yet, but we found it in South Australia. So, you know, it's not far away, and in New South Wales, so both borders, and it's not far away then. We probably just haven't looked hard enough. Another one, windmill grass. Roadsides. We picked up windmill grass, resistant to glyphosate, on roadsides in Victoria. It's not going to be long till that starts getting into paddocks. So that's something that we're concerned about. And the last one is brome grass. Our number of brome grass populations resistant to glyphosate doubled last year, We cut a sample from Victoria. Both the samples we have come from the same sort of situation. It's been an old fence line in the middle of a paddock. Selection has probably been primarily when the fence lines were sprayed, then the fence lines were taken out, and it's been continued to be sprayed with glyphosate as a preceding operation. So both these paddocks have a bit of a strip of glyphosate-resistant brome grass down the middle of the paddock. We don't actually have a huge number of controls for brome grass, so losing glyphosate on it's going to be quite a big issue if we can't get any of it before we seed. So I think this is something we've got to watch out for and try and manage brome grass a bit better. While I'm on glyphosate resistance, many of you will know that there's a registration coming for glyphosate as a crop topping application in canola. I think after what I showed you about managing select resistant ryegrass in canola, we can all agree that this is a good thing to have some more tools for canola. We also have currently a registration for hay, a registration for wheat, and a registration for most of the pulses. Only barley is not, of the main crops don't we have a registration. So there's going to be a real tendency of growers to want to crop top everything with glyphosate. And if they crop top everything in their rotation with glyphosate, we're going to get glyphosate resistant ryegrass. Okay, this ryegrass is just as resistant to crop topping as it is at the seedling stage. So crop topping is going to select for resistance. So I think that we really, if you've got growers who are saying, well, I want to put glyphosate under the cutter bar in canola or over the top of canola, and I want to use that, I think you're going to have to say to them, that means no glyphosate, crop topping in your pulses. You've got to use paraquat, crop topping in pulses. I think we just got to get growers' heads around that they can't use glyphosate for everything. We're only going to have registration for paraquat in pulses. The only place we're going to be able to use it, I think we need to make sure that we do use it and use that to really help protect our system. Okay, one last thing. You'll have all seen this in your packs. It's a thing about Weed Smart. None of you have actually heard about Weed Smart prior to today, and that's because it's a new program that hasn't yet been launched. It'll get launched in 2 weeks' time. But you're getting a sneak preview of Weed Smart. Now what Weed Smart is, it's a new campaign to try and get better management of herbicide-resistant weeds across the country. GRDC is investing in this, a lot of other industry players are investing in this, and they see it as being a key way of getting good herbicide-resistant information out. So look around for that. There's some stuff in there. Some you'll already know about, some you won't. And one thing I do want to sort of whet your appetite over is one of the things that they've done is to create an app. And this app, it's a iPhone, iPad app. And the idea is that a grower or a grower and their consultant can sit down and put their practices, what are they doing to manage their weeds, into the app, and it comes out and it tells them where they're sitting with respect to risk of herbicide resistance and risk of their weeds blowing out and getting a big weed problem. So I think this might be something that you could be tempted to use with your growers, particularly growers where you really perhaps want to change their thinking about what they're doing, and go with them and say, well, is what you're doing good practice, or do we have some holes in this that we've got to fix? So that app will be available in a couple of weeks. You can download it. It can be, because it's not an iPhone, you can do it all in the paddock. You don't have to have a computer or anything like that. So nice and simple, easy to use. You've got lots of practices to choose from. You just put it all in there. It comes up with an immediate answer about where that paddock or where that grower's practices are sitting. Okay, I've got a question. Where to in 10 years with no A, B, C, D, M and L? Life's going to be hard. What we do have is that we do have some other practices that are out there. What is crucial is that we get growers using those practices sooner rather than later. And it's a range of things we're thinking about, but a lot of them involve stopping weed seed set. So you all went to Tomb's talk yesterday on hay. You know, I think in our Northern Victorian survey, we've got a thing that I'll call the Tombs effect. All the growers who grow hay just don't seem to have huge amounts of resistant weeds because they're always growing hay. But it doesn't have to be hay. There's a whole range of it. You know, you've seen charcoal, they've got their problems. They've got sea structure, they've got their problems. But, you know, I think growers have got to choose one. They've got to decide that they're going to do one of these things. And if they don't want to do hay, well, there's some other things out there that they can do. But I don't think that we can be in a position of growers saying, no, I don't want to do any of that stuff. I want you to find me a new herbicide. Because whilst I've helped find a couple, and we're looking at some other stuff, and we've got some really exciting chemistry, we just don't have any crops we can use it safely in. You know, the chemical cupboard is not flush with material. Okay, we're not going to have a continual stream of new ryegrass products to come along. We've got to actually protect some of the ones we've got. So sooner rather than later.
You suggested the use of clethodim at 3 to 4 leaf ryegrass, which is obviously more effective. How far further down the track, like can we go to 1.5, 2 leaf?
Yes, you can. Well, 2 leaf you can go to. I wouldn't go too much earlier than 2 leaf because it doesn't. These herbicides don't seem to be hugely effective unless you've got 2 true leaves. You know, it's certainly possible to go earlier, and you know, we've had some absolutely, you know, tremendous results actually with a clethodim butroxydim mix on, you know, was a really bad ryegrass population. It was sort of sitting at that 1.5 to 2 leaf stage, and we salvaged a trial by just putting it out there and just taking all that ryegrass out. So, you know, you can actually go reasonably early, but I wouldn't go too much earlier than 2 leaf.
Chris, how long before we start seeing resistance to Sakura?
Well, maybe I should answer, I know where it's going to happen, so I'll be looking out for it. But that group of chemistry, what we know about that group of chemistry overseas is that it's quite robust with respect to resistance. You know, it's not immune, but it's quite robust. So, you know, we actually don't have a lot of metolachlor resistance, for example. You know, it's the same mode of action. So I'm expecting that we'll get, you know, as I say, a minimum of 10 years. I think it'll actually be more than that out of it before, you know, we might start seeing the first resistant populations. But, you know, when we start thinking about, well, we've got J's, we've got K's, we might still have a bit of D in our system, you know, we don't, you know, we've only got a decade or so, maybe 2, and we're going to be back where we were sitting at 2005 of looking at, well, what do we do about ryegrass control? So I think we need to protect these things. We need to do everything we can to protect this chemistry so it's got longevity, because we don't know what else is going to come. I mean, it might be totally different in 20 years' time, but we don't know.